Hello everyone and welcome to today's event hosted by the York Environmental Sustainability Institute based at the University of York. Our aim at YESI is to facilitate and deliver world-class research on environmental sustainability. And the aim of the Ask the Author series is to showcase research being done at the University of York and provide people with the opportunity to ask researchers about their work. A reminder that today's event is being recorded, and if you have any questions, you can type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And today I'd like to welcome Dr. Maddie Powell and Dr. Katie Pybus, who are based in the Department of Health Sciences at the University of York. And today they'll be talking about their paper looking at the links between poverty, income inequality, and food insecurity. So welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Jane. Right, I'll quickly share my screen. I can hopefully share a presentation. Right, so we go. Okay, can everyone see that? Katie, can you nod if that's looking all right? Okay, well, hello everyone. Thanks very much for coming. We're going to talk just very quickly about the background to the paper, the main findings and some key conclusions, and then hopefully leave enough time for some discussion. So the kind of first, I suppose, the main background to this study in particular was the work of the York Food Justice Alliance. So the York Food Justice Alliance was a multi-sector partnership, and it came together in 2018. A partnership between the University of York, experts by experience, and multiple kind of stakeholders working in the area of food poverty in York. And it came together because there was a kind of sense that actually food poverty was rising in York and food bank use was rising, but we didn't really know much about what was going on, about the nature of food insecurity, and there was desires for kind of an effort to tackle it collectively. So we came together to think about what research was needed in the community to better understand food insecurity. So the research that came, the research questions that informed this paper really came out of those discussions. And a priority for us as an alliance was households with young children. This was thought to be an area of need and an area that hadn't really been addressed in relation to food insecurity, which sort of tied in with the broader picture of austerity and government austerity, which very much had disadvantaged households with young children, who were also at greater risk of food insecurity than the general population. The kind of more national background as well to the study was that food bank use had clearly, most obviously, increased since 2010, suggesting rising food insecurity, but actually evidence was increasingly showing that food bank use was a poor proxy for food insecurity. So it didn't reflect the scale of food insecurity, and there's lots of kind of hidden hunger. So it's to get a sense of actually food insecurity beyond the food bank and the structural drivers of food insecurity, such as kind of social security. But we also kind of wanted to think about, as well as the local context, which is York and a kind of highly unequal city, and then link that with the kind of well-established evidence base on income inequality and how it relates to social and health outcomes. So kind of the work of kind of Kate Pickett, particularly about the fact that income inequality is detrimental to a range of health and social outcomes for all kind of members of society. And so we wanted to think about how that relates to food insecurity and the kind of particularly the psychosocial aspects of food insecurity and how that might relate to income inequality. So kind of the nature of the whole project was that it was co-developed and co-designed. So kind of at the beginning of the project, this is 2018, we kind of sat together over many meetings and thought about what our priorities were as an alliance, what we wanted to research, what we thought was a concern, and we kind of discussed extensively, and actually we came up with this particular group of households with young children, but also getting a better understanding of the kind of the systemic nature of food insecurity in the city. So which informed this study, which was then to focus on households with young children, but to explore kind of food insecurity and its drivers and how it relates to food bank use. So there's two kind of components which really made up this study. The first was a co-developed and co-administered survey of families with young children. And that was investigating food insecurity, demography of food insecurity, food bank use, the regularity and the nature of food bank use, and then kind of multiple household characteristics. So we administered the survey kind of using the links of the Alliance through primary schools. So primary schools sent it out to parents in their networks, and then parents would complete it about their household's experience. And then from that, we kind of had a kind of a large data set of kind of 612 people, but it kind of didn't really get to grips with the lived experience. So in addition, we co-developed and co-conducted focus groups with parents with young children. And it was a kind of opt-in. We just put out a kind of almost advertisement for people to come if they kind of self-identified as living in a low-income household, to talk about their experiences of food insecurity. So we held a number of focus groups, and members of the Alliance kind of helped with the kind of organisation of that, to explore lived experiences of food insecurity and food bank use. So I'm going to hand over to Katie now to talk about what we found.
Okay, thanks very much, Maddie, and hello to everybody. Yes, so should we just move on to the next slide, Maddie? Is that all right? And then okay, brilliant. So okay then, so I'm going to talk separately here sort of about food insecurity, and then also sort of our findings on food bank use, but obviously there's certainly some links there as well. But what we saw sort of in our sample was that there was a really strong relationship between household income and food insecurity, and you know, and lots of struggles around sort of affording food and sort of most notably healthy food on a low income. So if we kind of took our sort of middle household income bracket that we looked at in the study, which was households where the earnings were sort of £21,000 to £28,000 a year, those people were sort of 4 times less likely to be food insecure than people on the lowest incomes, so people where their household was under 16,000 a year. But kind of quite sort of noticeably here, and you know, it will be interesting to see if this finding you know, is replicated in other sort of unequal settings like York is. But actually we found that there was limited difference between experiences of food insecurity in the 2 lowest income groups. So households up to £21,000 a year in terms of income were similarly sort of at risk to those that were in households under 16,000 a year. So what that means is that you know, more people are potentially impacted when it's kind of quite an unequal setting. I'll talk a little bit more about sort of why that might be, but one of the things that we found that was sort of associated with food insecurity was housing. So for people who were renting, after we take income into account, they were 3 times more likely to be reporting sort of experiences of food insecurity, and that's across sort of social housing and privately rented housing. So it seems that sort of higher housing costs are also sort of having an impact. Another thing we found as well, so just for anybody who's not kind of from York or not familiar with York, we have here sort of quite a concentration of sort of lower income households near to the city centre, and what that means for sort of food experiences, and what people are telling us is that you know, we have sort of supermarkets that are kind of further out into the suburbs, so that food there is sort of you know, cheaper, and then we have kind of sort of smaller food stores in the city centre, but people were sort of stuck really because they either spent the extra money, or they either had to spend more money on transport going out to the suburbs to get cheaper food, or they were sort of stuck with city centre prices which were much higher. So obviously that was kind of you know, ends up with people sort of caught in a bit of a vicious cycle there in terms of affording food and, you know, good quality food as well. In terms of sort of thinking about the psychosocial impacts of food insecurity, so you know, what people were telling us, and I've got some quotes on the next slide, was that you know, higher quality food was only kind of available to people on a sort of higher income, and that being food insecure, or being unable to afford you know, healthy food options was actually quite a stigmatizing experience for people, and you know, people really wanted to be able to eat these foods and have a better diet, but were unable to do so, and that also, you know, in itself kind of brought along you know, impacts on self-esteem as well for people. So yeah, go to the next slide then, Maddie, thanks. Okay, so what we've got here is sort of some of our quotes. So we you know, conducted the focus groups, but also sort of in the survey there was an option for people to leave like a free text response as well. And we actually had sort of 136 of those free text responses. So we had quite a lot of, you know, basically kind of asking people what their experiences of food were like, so really broad. But, you know, it generated quite a lot of sort of response and interest from people. So here, this first quote from the survey is sort of people referring, you know, a respondent kind of referring to the fact that, you know, actually sort of the almost half the wages are kind of going on rent. And if you take into account kind of bills as well, you know, although that income might kind of seem relatively okay, you know, it's leaving people kind of struggling. And one of the things that we kind of didn't ask about in the survey, because of, you know, we had to kind of take into account sort of different priorities people had, and obviously not make it too long, but one of the things that we didn't ask about was debt. But, you know, that's potentially kind of also sort of an issue for people that's arising from kind of having to live in a context where housing and food and things are expensive as well. And the second quotes here are sort of, you know, relating to what I was just saying about, you know, sort of healthier food options or higher quality food options only being available to people on higher incomes, and the impact that sort of has on people's sort of self-esteem as well. So yeah, next slide then please, Maddie. Okay, so we also, as I said, kind of looked at food bank uses of that. It's worth noting here that we did have quite small numbers of people that had used the food bank in the sample. So, you know, just in terms of kind of need to treat these numbers with a bit of caution. But you know, actually what we found, and this has been replicated in lots of other studies as well, is that you know, it was only a fifth of our respondents that were actually kind of going and using a food bank when they were experiencing food insecurity. So that might be that there's, you know, people are kind of accessing other sort of avenues, you know, in order to kind of, you know, make sure they have access to food, or they're kind of struggling, you know, behind the scenes and not going to places like food banks where there's food available. But in terms of, you know, sort of similarly, if we take that kind of middle income group that we were talking about in our sample, so 21 to 28,000 pounds a year household income, those people were 10 times less likely to abuse the food bank than people on the very lowest incomes. And again, we sort of saw quite a little difference between the two lowest income groups. So, you know, suggesting potentially that quite higher numbers of people are affected, you know, when the cost of living is higher in places that are sort of more unequal. We also found sort of you know, again, a relationship with housing and food bank use. Here, though, it was the risks were more around sort of being in social housing. And there's a couple of potential sort of reasons for that. One of them is, you know, that the sort of demographics might be different for people who are sort of in social housing compared to private rented and homeowners, and particularly sort of social security, you know, being in receipt of social security, being unable to work due to health problems, those types of things, might mean that people are kind of, you know, impacted by some of the social security cuts that we've seen in recent years. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But you know, certainly in the responses we got from people, things like the 5-week wait attached to universal credit, you know, the thinking about kind of the benefit cap, which is at around £20,000 a year. So, you know, if we're looking at households that are more at risk, then, you know, we did find that for those two lowest income groups. You know, the other thing is that sort of living in social housing might come with kind of more support mechanisms that lead to more sort of referrals to food banks. So that might be also an access thing. But yeah, so I think that's everything from there. Thanks, Maddie.
Okay, so I'll quickly conclude and then we can kind of have a quick chat. So I think one thing that kind of really came out from the survey and from the focus groups was the question of whether this is about food insecurity or food poverty or really poverty. Because what it felt that we were identifying, at least in this setting, and I suppose it's generalisable, but only really maybe for similar kind of cities like York, so maybe somewhere like Cambridge, with similar levels of quite high inequality, but quite small cities, is that actually what was driving food insecurity was kind of what we would normally consider to be the structural drivers of poverty. So inadequate social security, low income, high living costs, particularly high housing costs and inadequate housing, issues with transport. So we were led to conclude really about whether this is a question of food poverty, or actually we just need to think about a multi-dimensional definition of poverty, and within that definition food is a component. And I think it's something that's kind of happened in the food insecurity research field, that food insecurity has been looked at often separately, like it's a kind of a phenomenon in its own right, which kind of essentially leads to a sort of medicalization of poverty, and maybe kind of distracts people from actually what are just kind of systemic drivers of poverty, which are now just getting much worse because of austerity. Just kind of thinking back to kind of the kind of relationship with inequality, I think something that was a key feature of this paper was about the kind of psychosocial impacts of living in an unequal context, and how that shaped experiences both for those who are living in poverty and can't afford to access food, and for people who are living in wealth, who are affluent. So kind of the effects of inequality for people who are poor means that actually stigma and shame around food poverty is much more pronounced, because sense of status and sense of your status being compromised is much more acute when you're really aware of yourself in a sort of social gradient. But actually on the other end of the spectrum, for people living in wealth, what we kind of found particularly in the survey responses, which were from parents from kind of all spectrums, all kind of across the income spectrum, was that actually there was a tendency towards a kind of paternalistic attitude towards people in poverty. So rather than kind of saying, actually, my response to rising food poverty in York, which I think is horrendous, is to campaign for change, is to kind of be involved in direct action or campaigns or advocacy. It was to say, oh, how can I care for these people? They might be caring in a food bank, or it might be kind of wanting to donate food to a food bank, but it was kind of paternalistic. It was about caring for them, kind of knowing what's best for them, which actually in itself is also about a kind of polarization, which means that people kind of don't kind of have solidarity with people, but they want to care for them. So it's something that kind of, another thing that really came up that Katie's talked about was housing, which actually in the food insecurity literature so far has been relatively neglected. There's a strong focus on social security and on the impact of austerity and rising use of food banks. And austerity has had a profound impact on food bank use. But there's been much less impact on housing, which actually for us came across really strongly as kind of independently related with food insecurity and food bank use. And I think we would stress that I think this needs much more attention, whether it's about housing costs, which certainly in York are immensely high. And so we weren't looking at kind of disposable income, we were just looking at income and then housing. So whether it's about housing costs or whether it's about the kind of the nature of support that you might have in rented in kind of social housing, which means you might be more in touch with referral services, which means you're more likely to be referred to a food bank. But this was like a kind of whole research field that actually hasn't had much attention. And then just quickly in terms of policy asks, so we recommended at the end of the study that actually income-based policy, kind of income-based policy approaches are clearly what's needed, given that this is a predominantly an income problem coupled with perhaps transport issues and access to kind of larger supermarkets. But certainly in the short term, I think we would advocate for the retention of the £20 weekly uplift in universal credit, which through other projects that we're working on at the moment is fundamental to family kind of food security and income security. And I think without it, many, many more people will find it difficult to access the food they need. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. That was really interesting. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So if anyone has a question that they would like to ask, if they can put it in the Q&A box, that would be great. There's also a chat box if you're having problems with that, and you can put questions in there as well. And I'll just give people a few minutes to ask a question. And while we're waiting for things to get going, COVID-19 has obviously had a lot of detrimental effects on people's mental health and security, but it has had the one positive of the £20 uplift. How important do you think that is, that that's retained now? I know you said it. You wanted it to be retained. How vital is it for people's security, income security, food security, mental health, that's continued?
Yeah, it's completely vital. I think it's in some ways actually what we're finding from, so another project that Katie and I are working on together at the moment is called COVID Realities, and we're working with parents and carers at the moment about their experiences of income and social security and food insecurity, or food poverty. And they're saying actually it's vital, but actually I was already in debt, like it's just helping me get by basically. And so essentially what's needed is more than £20, but £20 is absolutely the bare minimum of what's needed and what's needed to be retained.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree. And I think you know, it's about how long we kind of keep that in place for as well. And we really, the impacts and the after effects of the pandemic are going to continue for quite a while. And as Maddie said, people were really struggling before this. It's just about helping people to kind of pay some of those extra costs that they already had. So the idea of kind of removing that, particularly when things like the job market, cost of living, those kinds of things are still going to continue to be an issue for quite a long time, I think would be really harmful to a lot of families. So, yeah.
And will you be doing future research with the same cohort of people that you used for this paper, or will you be moving to different areas?
Well, so I'm doing some work now on food insecurity and mental health, and I'll be doing some work in York as well as in Bradford and Tower Hamlets. It won't be with the same cohort, but it will be in York, so it will be maybe picking up kind of same sort of ideas around the relationship with inequality. But what kind of has happened now to the York Food Justice Alliance is that it was taken over by two people with direct experience of food insecurity. So it's now kind of more from a kind of research collaboration, which it was initially when we were kind of setting it up and finding out what was going on in York, to much more of a kind of activist and kind of practical organisation. So they run a like a kind of small pay-as-you-feel shop in Spark, and they do lots of activism, and they're involved in lots of kind of campaigning around food poverty. So it kind of shifted a bit away from research.
Yeah, but a positive effect.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think we're all pleased to see it go in that direction.
Yeah. Questions come in from Smriti Safaya asking, could you share a little bit more about the distinction of the paternalistic approach of caring for the more socially, economically marginalised members of the community, and doing actions like supporting food banks, etc., and what you mean about being more in solidarity with them?
Yeah, so I think what I meant by that point, which I expressed terribly badly, was that there's kind of various approaches, I suppose, towards issues of social injustice, like food poverty or poverty. And what we have tended to see in the kind of UK response in the form of food banks is quite a paternalistic approach. So it's saying that actually people are in poverty, you recognise that they have needs, but actually you approach it in a paternalistic way, which means that you say, I know what their needs are and I know what they need and I will do it for them. And so, for instance, in a food bank, it's to kind of say, well, this person is hungry, they need this type of food. So I will give them this prescribed food parcel and a cup of tea, and that's what they need. And often this can come out in kind of particularly in rhetoric about the type of food that people should be eating. So the food bank parcel, for instance, is constructed to supposedly make up like a healthy parcel of food. So they tend not to put sugar in it. So it's these notions of what poor people should be eating. And they don't get the choice about what they should be eating, because unlike kind of people who have money can go to the shops, they have to go to a food bank. So it's taking that approach of sort of caring for them in that way of I know what's best for them, rather than kind of giving them the choice to make their own decisions, or saying actually this person shouldn't be in poverty in the first place. How can we think about like tackling the root causes that make them in poverty? And that actually might be part of being part of the York Food Justice Alliance, where we kind of essentially lobby the council to kind of implement better welfare schemes or implement better kind of hardship funds. So kind of that, taking that more approach of kind of solidarity with people in need, but that's not about kind of thinking about what they need, that's kind of talking to them and saying actually what's the best approach. What should we be doing? How can we fight this? How can we challenge this? Katie, would you add anything?
Yeah, and just to say, I think you know, I guess what that kind of sort of more solidarity approach does as well is like, you know, it starts to kind of look at these more structural drivers. So it starts to look at kind of rather than that kind of immediate response, it's sort of, okay, well, how can we, you know, make sure that people aren't living in poverty, and you know, that some of these issues that are making people really struggle do end up, you know, do get addressed. So.
Do you have anything else you'd like to ask, Smriti?
Oh, thank you. That pretty much does really clarify it for me. I am wondering as well if any of Vanessa Andreotti's work about the kind of critical action is also in something that you reference, because some of the things that you mentioned there about structural changes and having those deeper conversations about what it is at the core of these problems and how to address them. That's a tiny bit of what my research is interested in, although it's in a different field, but I'm really drawn to that as well. And I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't referenced her work here, but it's something that I certainly kind of work on slightly, or actually I suppose in relation to this, but I'm writing about at the moment, like that kind of having a kind of critical approach to all this, to any food poverty work. So addressing it critically, thinking about where are the power inequalities, where are the kind of systemic issues, and how can we kind of unpick them and work out who's gaining and who's losing. And then looking at kind of wider, how does like this work, this food poverty work, fit within wider social movements, like kind of movements about gender, movements about kind of climate change, like wider kind of progressive movements that actually are often quite kind of embedded in grassroots practice and do kind of see themselves in solidarity together as a movement and with other movements. So just thinking about this as a kind of wider critical movement and wider progressive movement.
That's great, thank you very much. We've got another question, one saying thank you for a great presentation, asking how do we make the government listen? They seem to accept children going hungry and incorrectly think that the problem is parents not buying the correct foods, when people, as you've said, don't have access to a wide variety of foods, or maybe don't have the time to cook a complete meal from scratch.
Katie, do you want to go first?
Yes, yeah, I mean, I think it's a tricky one, isn't it? You know, I think at the moment there's lots of kind of good campaigns going on around, you know, the post-pandemic response really, and keeping that kind of you know, universal credit uplift, and you know, I think just kind of advocating and sort of campaigning in those ways, you know, will hopefully really help to sort of you know, dispel some of these myths really, and also kind of take more of an income-based approach and sort of recognize that is the problem. And you know, it's not necessarily about you know, like you said, it's, you know, it's taking it away from that kind of individualized approach, which kind of then leads to kind of educational interventions, you know, this idea that people don't know how to cook, or that they're just not cooking the right things. You know, it's about focusing on these income-based things and trying to move it away from that conversation, I think, and dispel some of those myths. But yeah, it's tricky. I don't know if you guys have an idea.
No, I think just it is really tricky. I mean, it'd be really interesting to see what happens in the budget on the kind of 3rd of March, because there are so many organisations now saying that the £20 uplift should be kept. And if it isn't kept, I think it will be quite a clear reflection of where this government's priorities are, and actually the fact that however much lobbying from however many kind of high-profile charities and organisations, nothing's going to change. I mean, that sounds a bit sort of depressing, but I don't think it is, because I think actually I think we found with the York Food Justice Alliance was that actually you can have immense change and power at a local level, and I think sometimes local politics and local organising can be quite undervalued. But actually, before we started it, food poverty wasn't kind of collectively seen as such an issue in York, and then it became an issue. And now there's people who have direct experience of food poverty who are talking about it to the council, and who might be talking about it to organisations. And there's obviously huge challenges with any kind of local organisation and local politics, but it's now on the agenda, and local councils can do things, they can make change. So I think maybe in the face of maybe a government that's kind of makes you want to despair sometimes, actually looking what can be done at the local level.
I don't have a name, so I'm not sure if we can ask if they have any follow-up to your answer. Nothing's been typed, so thank you for your answer. We've got a question from Phil Kerrigan saying, would you be able to say a little bit more about the connections and possible tensions between doing research and getting involved in activism, championing change? Do you feel your research has a particular political framework, and what, if any, implications do you find this has, particularly when engaging with different policymakers who might adhere to other political frameworks? It's quite a lot in there.
I'll go first because there is quite a lot there, but it's very relevant. So I think when we started, just broader kind of the challenges and issue with kind of co-produced research, when we started the York Food Justice Alliance, there's lots of different people who maybe had different priorities, and actually bringing that together was challenging. But I think what maybe we were surprised by is that there were political frameworks about kind of maybe structural drivers of poverty, but also one thing that people did think was an issue at the beginning, or maybe was about people being able to cook or not being able to cook. So it wasn't just that people were thinking in a kind of systemic way, people were also thinking in a kind of maybe slightly more individualistic way. And so the other paper that's a kind of complementary paper to this was a paper that came out of discussions of some food aid organisations saying, oh, actually, if we think a problem is that people don't know about the constituents of a healthy diet, and they don't know about cooking. And so that's something that we see as maybe being an issue here. So we did a paper, we did a kind of another kind of investigation kind of within this same survey to kind of explore people's understandings of healthy diets and of the production of food, to get a sense whether actually maybe there was a problem about the fact that people did need more education about food and more detail about how to cook. But then what that paper showed us was actually that wasn't the case at all. People did have really good awareness of what a healthy diet was, and they just couldn't afford the constituents of a healthy diet. So I don't know whether that answers it at all, but I suppose maybe what I'm saying is that there wasn't necessarily actually a straightforward political framework that everyone ascribed to. In some ways, there actually was lots of contention and disagreement with the group within the group of people who'd worked for decades in York on different projects and hadn't come together. And actually it was a task initially to bring people together and to find common ground before we could then move forward and think about what the research focus was.
Thank you. Do you have any comeback on that, Philip?
That's great. That's really interesting and helpful. So thanks very much for that. That's brilliant and great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question from behind the panel here. So there's been a lot of talk about food poverty in the last few years. It's really come to the fore, but obviously you're pointing out that it's more kind of one part of a wider, it's poverty effectively. Why do you think that it's kind of felt like it's being siphoned off into a specific focus area? Where do you think that's come from? And obviously it's something we might need to pull back from, but do you know what the underlying process has been? Why it's become such a focal point?
Do you want to go, Kate, or shall I?
Yeah, you might be better placed with this one, I think.
I'll have a go. I would say that actually a big reason why it's been kind of constructed as food poverty rather than poverty is that it initially had a food bank response. And so rather than what happened under the coalition was that kind of local councils used to have like local hardship funds, where if somebody was in urgent need, like they didn't have any money for food or their freezer had broken, their fridge had broken, they could go to the council and apply for a grant, and they would get a small grant from the council that would cover like immediate needs. And those basically disappeared under the coalition. Or essentially they were localised, but the money was taken away from them. So there is still a small one in York, and they've tried to do some kind of better promote it recently, but it's still not particularly easy to access, and it's not particularly big. So I suppose it was that and so simultaneously with that, people's poverty suddenly became like sudden, and they were suddenly put into destitution by new policies under austerity, so by the sanctions programme and then by the 5-week wait for universal credit. So people, they technically, I suppose, they were in food poverty, they couldn't afford food, but it was actually just because they were in dire poverty and desperate poverty. What they really needed was money. But the main response to them needing money was to give them food, because we set up food banks. And I think you're not, I think it's a narrow understanding of why food banks are there if you're just saying they're there because people need food, because you could give them money. Do you know what I mean? Food banks could give people cash. So this is a very long-winded way of saying that actually there are various reasons why food banks exist, and one of the main reasons is because there's a desperate need for some sort of support. But it's also because food banks do serve other needs for communities. Like they can be places where religious groups can come together and kind of perform an ethos of charity, which is fundamental to many religions, particularly to Christianity. So Just for Trust is a Christian organisation, and the food banks are all Christian, and there's a different motivation there as well. So essentially, this kind of being encapsulated by, there's discussions going on at the moment about whether or not food banks should give people money rather than food. As the approach is in the global south, the approach is not to give people food, the approach is to kind of give people grants or money to make them kind of self-sustaining, because food it's not a kind of a sensible approach in development strategies. It's not a long-term strategy to give someone food. But in the UK, when we have discussions about whether or not people should be given money in food banks rather than food, people are very reticent to give people money, because then it comes back to all the conversations about, oh, but they'll spend it on the wrong thing. They'll spend it on alcohol or cigarettes, which is coming back to what we were talking about earlier about like the distrust of people in poverty and a paternalistic approach to what they need. So we constructed food poverty as food poverty because it meant that we could give people food rather than give them money. And so we know what they're doing. They're just going to go and open those tins. I mean, realistically, most people don't use half the stuff in a food bank parcel because their kids don't like it, or it's kind of they've got nothing to do with that kind of food. It doesn't make a meal. So I think in some of there's a wider socio-political context of why we are approaching this with a food response rather than with a cash response, where people are just really poor and they just need money to buy food.
Thank you. I was waiting to see if Robin came back with anything further.
No, thank you. That's really useful. Yeah, thank you.
And another question's come in asking, do you have any insights on the influence of different demographic factors, such as is it at all about income, or does food poverty play out differently in different age groups, younger parents versus older parents? Are there any racial or ethnic differences? Are people less vulnerable if they have access to an extended family? Does level of education matter?
Yes, so there definitely are demographic differences. For instance, like let's take in who's using a food bank. There's very few older people using food banks. And this may be partly about shame and stigma among that group, but it's also aligned with kind of the fact that pensions are still not big, but they have been the only thing that's been uprated under the coalition with the kind of triple lock on pensions. So pensioners tend to be relatively better off than often younger families with children who are more likely to use food banks. There are also racial and ethnic differences in who's using food banks and who is in food insecurity. So the data on this is actually quite poor. In the United States, for instance, there's a very kind of food insecurity and food poverty is very clearly stratified by race. So people who are Black or Latino are much more likely to be in food insecurity and to use food banks, what they call food pantries in the US, than white people. And in the US particularly, kind of food banks are staffed by white people and used by Black communities. In the UK, it's much less straightforward, and there's kind of some evidence, and I've done some research on this, that suggests that food banks could be quite exclusionary, and actually because they can be quite white spaces, often run by white volunteers and often based in churches, they can actually be quite exclusionary to people who might be from ethnic or religious minority groups. We'd expect that actually people in ethnic minority groups might be at higher risk of experiencing food insecurity just because they're at much higher risk of poverty because of racism, racial discrimination, racial stigma. But actually in the data that we have, they don't seem to be at higher risk of food insecurity, but I think that's something that needs to be a bit further explored really. Again, kind of, so extended family could matter. So often what we do find at food banks is that, as well as maybe kind of families, there can be lots of single men, maybe who are homeless or vulnerably housed, who don't have social support, who don't have familial and social support networks, who are using the food bank because they haven't got that kind of wider support. And so having kind of families can be helpful, having social support networks can be helpful, but because the stigma and shame of food poverty, actually sometimes people are quite reticent about seeking help from their parents or their friends because they don't want to disclose the fact that they can't afford food. Katie, do you want to add anything?
But yeah, I mean, and I guess sort of, you know, perhaps to add as well, just sort of, you know, people who have disabilities as well, you know, might be more likely to go to a food bank, and, you know, leading back to kind of some of the things that Maddie was talking about there, really, in terms of sort of vulnerabilities and risks. But, you know, and, you know, again, groups that are kind of using the social security system, I suppose, so which again sort of brings it back to the kind of income point. But, you know, people who are, you know, people become at risk through sort of mechanisms within the social security system, so sanctioning, like, you know, the universal credit 5-week wait, that type of thing. So yeah, there was something else I was going to add, but I can't remember what it was, so yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
And again, it's anonymous, so I'm not sure if they have any follow-up that they would like to ask. I don't know if we can unmute, or if they want to type any question in the Q&A. I'll mark that as done for now. And I'm just waiting to see if anything else comes in. And I see that you've recently had a paper published on the Emerald Open Access Gateway, which follows on, I suppose, from the work that you've done here on
yeah, so that was the other paper that kind of complemented this, that was looking more about diet and diet quality and people's attitudes towards diet and cooking and all that kind of stuff, really. So yeah, so if you're interested about that kind of wider kind of framing and individual framing of diet and choices, that's the paper to go to.
Excellent. Do you think that we will see the effects of this in the future, health-wise, on effects on the national health as a result of poor diet and food insecurity, income inequality? Do you think this is going to be a problem that we live with for a long time, not just with the fact that people don't currently have enough food, but the effects of that on their life going forward?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you kind of think that one of the things that we were looking at really is sort of fruit and vegetable consumption, and whether people are able to meet that kind of public health guideline of sort of, you know, 5 portions of fruit and veg a day. And actually we've found that people sort of really struggle with that, and they told us in the responses as well, you know, the qualitative data that you know, people were struggling to afford levels of fruit and vegetables. And so, you know, certainly that's, you know, likely to have longer term impacts on people, particularly if you think that this is you know, if you're living on a low income and that's a sort of sustained thing that's going on over time, then you're going to have that sort of malnutrition going on and, you know, obviously the longer that goes on, the more likely that is to impact on your health in the long term. The other thing is, if we're thinking about families with children as well, you know, so we're talking about kind of, if we're looking at sort of at children and their kind of trajectories throughout their lives, you know, if kind of that starting life is not being able to kind of access the right amount of nutrition, then, you know, we know that has lots of knock-on effects for people in the future.
And following on from the previous question, with the caveat that it would obviously be good not to have food banks at all, do you have any recommendations for how food banks could be made better?
I would say they should definitely be open access. So most food banks, probably a majority of food banks at the moment, operate on a referral system. So you can't just go to the food bank and get food. You have to go to a social worker, you'll ask your child's school, go to your GP and get a voucher from someone on citizens advice, and they write in that voucher why you need the food, and then you go to the food bank, you give your voucher, they might ask you again why you need the food, then you finally get a food parcel. But a kind of what's increasingly being written about, I suppose, kind of in academic fields, but obviously has kind of broad implications, is that how this creates a kind of deserving and undeserving poor. Like, you either do deserve a food bank voucher or you don't, and who really is there to make the decision whether you do deserve food or not? So as a first step, just to get rid of that, just to make them open access. I mean, food banks, attending a food bank is kind of, as many people kind of tell us, is such a shameful and kind of stigmatized experience that people would rarely do unless they really had to. And so we're just reducing those barriers, and then within the context of the food bank, thinking about how you can kind of reduce bureaucracy, make it much less like the job centre. Like, there's lots of comparabilities between how job centres work and how food banks work, in terms of like the way that staff and the clients are meant to interact, the way they collect lots of information. So just breaking down those sorts of barriers and making them much more welcoming spaces. So there was places in York, for instance, that like would operate as a cafe, but actually they'd also had a kind of an open access food bank, so anyone could take just food that would be in the back of the cafe, and the majority of that food will probably be fresh. So just thinking about other models of distributing food that are much less stigmatizing.
Thank you. And another question asks, how can we assess food insecurity for research, and how do you think fruit and vegetable consumption could be improved? Could a voucher scheme, specific financial support work for that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Maddie sort of has got more experience in food insecurity research than me, but you know, I think what I would say is from this research, there was a real kind of value to having sort of quantitative and qualitative methods of looking at food insecurity. So whilst we kind of you know, use the kind of particular measure for the quantitative survey data, you know, actually kind of getting that real richness of people's experiences and that sort of nuance and detail was really you know, important, and it told us a lot. You know, it gave us a lot of context around kind of what you know, whether or not people were saying they were food insecure, what that experience was like. And what was the second part of the question?
Could you look at a voucher scheme or specific financial support work for access to fruit and veg?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, again, that second paper that we've just been talking about, you know, what it came down to in that was just sort of money. So people, you know, really wanted to kind of go out and buy fruit and veg, but they just couldn't afford to do it, or they couldn't afford to do it at a level that kind of approached public health guidance, or that, you know, would constitute a nutritional diet. So you know, for me, I think it's certainly about how we can increase people's incomes, and if we do so, the evidence suggests that people will then go out and you know, buy fruit and vegetables and have a healthier diet. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add, Maddie, but
just that there could be a kind of element of like kind of planning decisions in this about access. So it's very much about having the money to buy that fruit and veg, but it's also about what shops can you access. So actually there's clearly problems about planning of like, so in York, for instance, like in the centre of town, it's full of like very expensive cafes, and there isn't a grocer's, and there's like a couple of really expensive bakers. And this is in like a centre of town for supposedly kind of, well, not a large, but a sizable population. So thinking about planning decisions about what shops are available for the population in a certain area, and does that supply fruit and veg, and is that fruit and veg affordable, rather than just having another kind of like one-stop shop? Or so there's roles for local authorities and their kind of planning departments to think about the shops that are available.
Do you have anything else you wanted to ask, Gemma? No, she's all good. Thank you. And I have another question from Anna Perrett asking, do you think that the type of mutual aid groups you've that have started to offer more informal food banks, open access food, will become more common as they do help people get around the formality of having to request vouchers through organisations?
Yes, hopefully. I think maybe my response to this question is that the mutual aid groups that kind of started certainly in the first lockdown, the COVID lockdown, were like a fantastic example of like local solidarity, and just the fact they were using the term mutual aid was kind of fantastic in what it represents in its history. Some of those kind of didn't really continue so much after the first lockdown, because people then had to go back to work, and so there's questions about maybe how sustainable is that provision. But I think maybe, at least like the kind of analysis that I've come to of kind of food poverty, is there's like two aspects here. It's like food poverty is mainly caused by poverty, so we need to deal with what's causing poverty. And a lot of that is to do with government austerity, the 5-week wait for universal credit, benefit sanctions, really low rates of benefits, really low wages, insecure jobs. Those have to be dealt with if we're going to deal with food poverty. But there's great value in sharing and eating food together in a community, and that should be celebrated and that should be encouraged. It's never going to be a solution to food poverty, because people need to buy the food they want to eat, like everybody else does. But actually you can come together around a meal in a community cafe, something that's open access that anyone can go to, and you can talk about why you're there, and you can talk about like problems that you've had accessing food and what could be done, and you can become politicized. And so there's great kind of opportunity there in those groups, but they can never be a solution to food poverty, but they can be a vehicle to progressive change.
Do you have any comeback or anything else you'd like to ask, Anna? No, I presume that that answered the question. Oh, it did. Thank you. But it was a really interesting discussion today. Lots of things to think about and things I didn't know that I've learned. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And this will go up on YouTube, our YouTube site, in the next day or so. So if you missed anything or want to listen again, you can do so, and you'll get a link out from us about that. So once again, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks very much. Thanks.
Thank you.